Right, you should have the seats code there. Do you all know what I'm talking about when I say seats? If you could let me know if it works for you, it'd be interesting because I've heard it all went down.
Can you make it a bit bigger?
Yeah. Sorry, it's not. Should be on that one. Where's the one? There you go.
Thank you.
Okay, this room's got quite good tech. Right, we'll wait a couple more minutes, just in case people are trying to find the room. How does that code work for you?
It hasn't worked for you.
No, okay. Can I suggest a fail-safe? I'll pass this round with a pen. Do it the old-fashioned way, and you just write your name. Can you try and write it in capitals, please? So we'll start with that and then do it kind of systematically.
I think there's a 2 in between the 7 and 4. That's definitely work for me. So just try it.
Okay, maybe it's me. Try it with the 2 between the 7 and the 4.
Yeah.
Okay, apologies. Good start to the module. So like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay, for those of you that have just arrived, there's a handout sheet down the bottom if you'd like it, and there's a few at the back. Okay, it's 5 past and we get started. So welcome everyone. Welcome back. Hope you had a good summer. And welcome to Poly 32071, Between War and Peace. So I'm James Patterson. I'm a professor of politics here and I'm the course leader for this module. This module aims to consider what should be done instead of going to war. So over the next few weeks, we're going to look at all the potential alternatives to going to war, the ethical issues around them, from economic sanctions to non-violence, cyber war to diplomacy, and challenges with rising global authoritarianism. Now today is going to be a bit duller, unfortunately. It's going to be just an introduction to the course. So first half of the lecture, I'm going to introduce the course, explain exactly what we're going to look at, reasons why it's important, and in the second half of the lecture, I'm going to run through the responsibility to protect doctrine, that forms the basis for some of the thinking around the alternatives to war. We'll have a break in the middle. This lecture is probably going to be a bit shorter as well. So let me start by saying a little bit about me, because I don't think I've taught many of you before. So my work lies in between political philosophy and international relations. I've written 4 books, one on humanitarian intervention, one on responsibility to protect, one on the ethics of private military and security companies, one on the alternatives to war, which is that one, which is the kind of the focus of today, this module. And more recently, I've had a book only out this July on prioritizing global responsibilities, which we're going to look at some of the themes that book discusses in week 8. So you'll be pleased to know that you don't have to buy all my books for the course. You're very welcome to. I get 5% of all sales, which is, I get about £50 a year. But they're all available online if you're interested. Okay, I've also got a slightly rubbish website, jpatterson.weebly.com, and a Twitter feed that I'm not really a big Twitter person because it's just full of opinions at best. But occasionally I might post stuff that's relevant sometimes. Okay, I have got 2 daughters. One is 10 and one's 14. They're both big Swifties, if you know what a Swiftie is. And I've also got a cat. His name is Theo. But my main love is Leyton Orient Football Club. If you manage to get Leyton Orient Football Club into your essays or assignments, there might be bonus points, as long as you use them positively. Okay. I've been at Manchester about 15 years, been undergraduate director, research director, and a few years ago I had a research funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council to work on the project on the ethics of the alternatives to war, and exactly what this module is on. And the project was the first of its kind. There's been no other detailed examination of the ethics of the alternatives to war out there by anyone else in the field. And more recently, I've had money from the British Academy to look at the ethical challenges posed by the changing global order, which we're going to look at later in the module. So what this means for you is that the module is based on cutting-edge, brand-new material. It's the only module on this topic in the whole of the UK and probably the whole of the world. So hopefully you'll find exploring the ethics of alternatives interesting and learn a lot. When I did the research for this and done research, continue to do research, I found it very interesting and stimulating. Okay, let me run through how the course is going to work. So I've tried to design it as straightforward as possible. There's essentially 3 parts to the module. First part, very short. It's considered some of the theoretical background surrounding the debate around the alternatives to war. And in particular, we're going to look at responsibility to protect, we'll look at today, just war theory next week, that forms the basis for some of the theoretical thinking about how we assess the alternatives. Part 2, we go through all of the alternatives in order. And then finally, in part 3, we look at the future and current challenges and how they affect the case for the alternatives. Now, there's a lot involved with all of the alternatives, very complex, and it might be hard to get your head around all of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on each one discreetly. So we're going to take one in turn and look at it closely. So what this means is that if you don't quite follow all the arguments or the details in one week, you should still be able to follow the arguments in the next. But on the other hand, to get the best mark for the overall module, you'll need to get fully to grips with what's covered in the whole course. So there is interrelation between the arguments that we look at in one week and sometimes in relation to the other. Okay, the assignments. These should be pretty straightforward for you. Given it's your 3rd year, we're trying to make it a quite straightforward form of assessment. So you've got an essay, you've got a short exam, 1 hour online. I'm trying to finalise the details of what that will involve. But in the previous years, I can tell you, it's been quite straightforward. There have been 7 questions on the 8 substantive alternatives that we look at. So what that has meant in the past that students have had to revise 2 or 3 alternatives in detail rather than doing all of the different topics. And then there's seminar engagement, 10%. Which I'll say more about in the seminars on Friday. Okay, a few more points before I start to run a bit more detail about the course. So the handouts, in case you haven't noticed already, the handout in front of you is the same as the PowerPoint. So my aim is to give you a detailed handout so you don't have to spend ages taking notes. You've got something to scribble on, thoughts that you want to add. Hopefully that'll be helpful. I would endeavour to bring along printouts of at least some of the handouts every week. I can't guarantee that I'll be able to do it for everyone, but I will try my best. Okay. Office hours, first seminars start this week. Fridays, all the seminars are on Fridays. Office hours immediately after the lecture. If you want to have an appointment, please do email me because I have quite a few people coming. If you want a different time, I'm flexible, we can arrange to meet. If you want to meet online, have a quick chat online, I can meet online as well. Blackboard, please keep abreast of Blackboard for announcements and course materials. I've posted some stuff up there already, including the module guide, obviously, and we'll continue to post stuff. One thing I'll flag is that the module guide is what we kind of call weirdly a living document. So it will evolve a little bit. There's going to be various resources that I've brought in for the library, for instance, that aren't in yet. And then once they're in, I'm going to update the module guide. And if you've got, for instance, any suggestions for sources as well, they can also be added as well. There should be a handout floating around. Do you know where the handout's at the back? Yeah, it's the handout. And the seats code is there if you need it. Okay. So let me say something about the content of the course. So the course is driven by the overarching question of what should be done instead of going to war. It lies in between, the content's going to lie in between political philosophy and international relations. So what this means is if you're more confident in the philosophical questions, political philosophy, you can look more in the philosophical elements of it. On the other hand, if you're more confident with empirical stuff, got more of an IR, international relations background, then you can focus more on the empirics and look at those in more detail and focus less deep in the philosophical issues. You can take it either way. So as I said, the module's been driven by the overarching question of what should be done instead of going to war. Well, why should we care about this? So I've got a nice quote here. Anyone know who that's from? Won the Nobel Peace Prize. That's a Colin. Anyone want to hazard a guess? Anyone been through the slides?
Obama?
Yeah, Obama, very good. So, right, let me see if this works.
Mr. President, the floor is yours to give your Nobel lecture.
First, in dealing with those nations that break rules and laws, I believe that we must develop alternatives to violence that are tough enough to actually change behavior. For if we want a lasting peace, then the words of the international community must mean something. Those regimes that break the rules must be held accountable. Sanctions must exact a real price. intransigence must be met with increased pressure, and such pressure exists only when the world stands together as one.
Good, okay, right, I've managed to. Okay, a bit more specific. So why exactly we should be concerned about the alternatives? So I want to highlight 3 reasons in particular. The first is that there's not much clarity out there about exactly what should be done instead of going to war, instead of how we should respond to complex crises. So you're probably very familiar with the crises, ongoing crises in Gaza, and ongoing crisis in Ukraine. So let me say something about Syria that you might not know quite as much. So the conflict in Syria started in March 2011 in the context of the Arab Spring with a relatively peaceful uprising against the Assad government's authoritarian rule. And in response to Assad's brutal crackdown on the protesters, it quickly spiraled into a complex regional war involving various international actors, including Hezbollah, Russia, the UK, the United States, France, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Now, it was far from obvious what should have been done to address the situation. There was a debate, but much of the debate was around military intervention against the Assad regime. Despite the UK and US coming close to intervening in September 2013 against Assad's use of chemical weapons, most commentators viewed that it would be too difficult to intervene successfully against the Assad regime given Russian backing and the military capabilities of Syria. After 2014, the debate turned to whether military intervention should be launched against the Islamic State, ISIS, which at first was by the United States and France and later by the UK. Again, the case for military intervention largely dominated the discussion. There is very little understanding of what, if anything, could be done instead of going to war. And there was a general sense in the commentary that not going to war, not launching military intervention was akin to doing nothing. And that's patently false, and that's something we're going to look at in this module. And in the meantime, it's estimated that more than 500,000 people died in the Syrian conflict. And Syria is not alone. There are lots of other cases where we don't have a strong understanding of the role that the alternatives to war could play. Secondly, fighting wars, and particularly wars of self-defense, are options that only really, beyond wars of self-defense, are options that are only available to a handful of states. It's very difficult for a state to fight a war in another country. The alternatives to war that we're going to look at are open to a lot more states as foreign policy options, open to smaller powers, and also open to non-state actors, be they in the global south or in the west. And so one of the things I want to pick up on this module and to emphasize is to reflect the demands and the multitude of actors beyond those simply in the west, but also those across the whole world, many of which are able to undertake these alternatives to war, even if they lack the military capacity to use military force abroad. Okay, thirdly, considering the alternatives to war seems important because major Western powers are less likely to wage wars in the future. And this is for a few reasons. The first is probably the most interesting. Despite ongoing conflicts, the world has, until recently, generally been seen as becoming more peaceful. And this is according to the Harvard scholar Steven Pinker, who argues this in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. So I'm going to show you a video here in a second, but this is just up until recently. You'll see that the rate of battle deaths in armed conflicts has massively decreased. What would it be around about the 50s? Anyone?
Korean War.
Korea, yeah. 70s, 60s, 70s. Yeah, Vietnam. 80s.
Afghanistan.
Yeah, maybe Afghanistan.
Rwandan genocide.
That's 90s, 80s. Anyone? Iran-Iraq war, probably that was main contributor to that. So, but generally, it's on a downward trend, at least until recently. Similarly, prevalence of mass killings, generally on a downward trend, again until recently. Interesting video here. Now before I show it, I want to caveat that this video is from a few years ago, and I don't necessarily agree with it all. I'm not sure, I'm not convinced by everything they say, but I still think it's interesting, so I wanted to show. Help if it actually works. Okay, give me a second, it might need to. Why is that not?
Violence and war. The insane brutality of ISIS continues. The Russians are invading Ukraine, and the Palestinians and Israelis continue to slug it out. Does that make you feel gloomy? Well, don't, because if you look at the numbers, war actually seems to be going out of fashion, while the global population is at an all-time high. It seems that we live in the most peaceful period in human history. How is this possible? As of September 2014, there were 4 conflicts going on in the world that had caused at least 10,000 people to die since January 2013. 9 conflicts that killed more than 1,000 people, and 13 that killed more than 100 since January 2013. Not really peaceful, but consider this. Of all the conflicts going on, none is an active war between countries. They are either civil wars or local conflicts. Although civil wars are terrible and cause huge suffering, their impact is usually way smaller than a war between nations or empires. When 2 nations engage in war, they can mobilize much bigger forces, have access to all of the state's resources and logistics, and almost to all of the population. So why have we transitioned from wars between nation states to civil wars? A lot of it is to do with colonialism and the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, a major driver of armed conflict vanished too. But the breakup of the communist dictatorships revealed new or old tensions and brought new conflicts in the now freed states, which often resulted in civil war. Much more importantly, in 1945, nearly all of Africa, much of Asia and parts of Latin America were under colonial rule. By 1990, all but a few islands were independent. But wait, couldn't you argue that what today's multinational corporations are doing in the Third World is just as bad as colonialism? Let's look at Congo. It was established as a colony in 1885 by the Belgian king, an area 80 times the size of Belgium. Violence committed against the indigenous Congolese and the ruthless system of economic exploitation had killed about half of the population by 1908. About 10 million Congolese were executed or starved to death. Millions were mutilated and traumatized. The economic exploitation of the Congo remained the top priority, and forced labor never really ceased completely until the end of Belgian rule in 1960, which is not really that long ago. So no, Colonialism was much worse than vulture capitalism is today, and it ended just 2 generations ago. Most of the conflicts that are going on right now are in areas that 60 years ago were under foreign control. But things are getting better. Until 1989, victory for one side in a civil war was common, while nowadays victories are much rarer. At the same time, negotiated endings have jumped from 10% to almost 40%. What about the rest of the world? Why have nation-states stopped attacking each other? There are 4 major reasons. 1. Democratization. The steady development from autocracy to democracy. Democracies hardly ever fight each other. Of all the state-against-state wars fought since 1900, only a minority were fought between democracies. 2. Globalization. War is just not as effective at achieving economic goals as it used to be. Today, it's almost always cheaper to buy resources on the global market than to seize them by force. People from other nations are more valuable to us alive than dead, which overall is a pretty new concept. 3. War is so 20th century. Until World War I, warfare was seen as an inevitable part of the human experience and as a valuable tool which you could use to achieve goals when diplomacy hit a brick wall. Today we have rules that declare acts of aggression illegal and stipulate that armed force is only justified in self-defense or with the authority of the UN Security Council. These rules are still broken, but today it's harder to do so without sparking opposition and disapproval. Also, we have an international court for war crimes in The Hague, and that's a very recent innovation. 4. Borders are mostly fixed now. After World War II, territorial wars generally stopped when most countries pledged to accept international borders and respect other nations' autonomy. But is all of this just an anomaly, or are we on the road to lasting peace? Truth is, we don't know yet. We need a big enough sample to rule out the historical average, which is about 1 or 2 big wars per century. We just haven't had enough time since World War II to rule out the possibility that war is not going away. If we don't have one major war in the next 75 years, we can be really confident that humanity is changing. So, you see, war might be over. Yes, there are nasty conflicts going on in many places, but overall, things are getting better, and we can make them even better by speaking up for peace and democracy.
Okay, I want to emphasize that take that video with a large pinch of salt. At the time it was produced, even then, it holds on to what's called the declinist thesis, which is the idea that there is a decline in war, and that was controversial. There's an academic literature on it. And since then, there's been a spike in mass atrocities, a spike in conflicts, obviously, Ukraine, Russia, Azerbaijan against Armenia. And in the later on in the lecture, one of the things we're going to look at in week 9 in particular was whether rising global authoritarianism is changing the picture, changing this picture that we present. Still, it's an interesting video. Okay. Let's get back to the reasons why we should be concerned about the lack of the alternatives to war. So there seems also to be a decreased public appetite for large-scale military interventions. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were extremely unpopular in the end, and it seems unlikely that the Western powers would undertake a major war given the ineffectiveness of those actions. Thirdly, there's reductions in the military capabilities of major Western powers to undertake wars and interventions. They've focused a lot more on technological capabilities these days rather than the ability to maintain large militaries in foreign theatres. And fourthly, it looks very unlikely to be able to secure UN Security Council approval for foreign interventions in the future. There was for the 2011 Libyan intervention, but it seems unlikely that that would be forthcoming in the future. because there's a lot more disagreement now between Russia, China, and the US, France, and the United Kingdom. Okay, so those are some reasons why we should be concerned about the content of the module. Let me now say something about what exactly it's going to be looking at. Now, the module isn't going to be focused on preventing war. And I want you to bear in mind, there's an awful lot that could be done to prevent war over the longer term. So educating people, decreasing poverty could do a lot to reduce war over the longer term. What with that focus on preventing war, we're not going to look at that. We're focusing on what could be done to respond to ongoing crises or ones that are just about to break out. So, how to respond to a crisis such as Sudan right now? How do we deal with that? The second thing is that I want you to bear in mind is that there's an awful lot of stuff, bad stuff that goes on in the world. Every year, Amnesty International produces an international report. This is the one from last year. It reported issues in 155 countries. Many of the violations of human rights, though, were of relatively small scale. I mean, it's still awful, but relatively small scale. We're going to focus on the more serious cases. And in particular, we're going to focus on the cases where there might potentially be a justification of war, in theory at least. So, in particular, when there's mass atrocities ongoing, when people are being slaughtered by their government or by non-state actors, genocide, mass killing, or when there's major aggression, when another state is about to invade another, when a state's threatening to invade another. Recent case to give you is Venezuela have threatened over the summer a lot to invade Guyana. So what can we do potentially to consider the alternatives in these sorts of cases? So next week we're going to look at just war theory. Seemingly very easy question. What in particular is wrong in with war? But it's far more tricky when we get into the details. And so we're going to focus on the critique provided by just war theory. Some of you might have looked at just war theory before. It holds that war can sometimes be morally justified, but is also generally extremely problematic. We're going to look at the central principles of jus ad bellum and jus in bello, and use the conceptual framework that this provides to provide the critique of war, and also as a framework for helping thinking through some of the alternatives that we're going to look at in later weeks. Then we consider the alternatives proper. So in week 3, we consider what's probably the most obvious alternative, which is economic sanctions. We consider various forms of sanctions, such as smart sanctions and arms embargoes. As you might be aware, economic sanctions and arms embargoes have been heavily criticised for harming the innocent, for being very indiscriminate. We look at those sorts of objections and responses to them. In week 4, we look at diplomatic measures, sometimes seen as doing nothing, but there's in fact quite a lot that states can do diplomatically. So we're going to look at things such as naming and shaming, the cutting of diplomatic ties. These measures raise some interesting issues. So, for instance, is it okay for the UK to criticise other states about their human rights record when we don't have a perfect human rights record ourselves? In week 5, we look at an option that quite a few of you might be a bit sceptical about, and this is non-violence, non-violent resistance. So after all, you think you're walking down the street and you're going to get attacked, you wouldn't think that non-violence is necessarily going to help you. But in fact, we'll see that there's quite a lot going for non-violence than is often realised. Findings suggest that non-violent revolutions are 6 times more likely to work than violent ones. And apparently, non-violent resistance even worked against Nazi Germany. So there are interesting measures such as civilian peacekeeping, which basically involves unarmed bodyguards, and civilian defense, which is unarmed resistance to an occupation, for instance, that proponents think might work in lots of cases. And so we can look at the case for those and the issues that they raise. And we'll also, in doing so, look at the ethics of pacifism and whether the links between non-violence and pacifism and how persuasive pacifism is. Week 6, we consider another little understood alternative, and this is the use of positive incentives, so carrots, if you like, mine. And this differs from a lot of the other things that we're going to look at that all involve sticks, whack states or rebel leaders into doing something. Positive incentives to stop aggression. Suppose, for instance, that you could have paid Assad $500 million to step down in Syria. Would that have been the right thing to do? Obvious worry that it would reward aggressors, but some of you might still think it'd be okay. So in week 6, we look at the various issues around positive inducements, positive incentives. Then in week 7, we look at cyber war. We consider whether cyber war should be considered an alternative to war, and the potential pitfalls and benefits of using it. So, for instance, some view digital attacks as much preferable, much better than all the various alternatives. Then in week 8, I put under the future. So we look at the challenges facing the alternatives in light of the changing global order. So firstly, week 8, we look at the question of whether we should conceive the alternatives much more broadly. So rather than trying to tackle aggression and mass atrocities, should states instead be doing other things completely, focusing their efforts on climate change and, say, doing a lot better in terms of tackling global diseases. So we look at the issue of how states should prioritize more generally their resources and the principles that states might use for that. And in doing so, we consider the opportunity costs of going to war, the amount of money that costs of going to war, and whether the money might be better used elsewhere. Then week 9, we look at resisting global authoritarianism. And in this week, we look at the challenges that rising global authoritarianism, the decline of democracy globally, the challenges that this poses for the previous weeks, and what might be done against global authoritarianism in particular. And there's something called militant democracy that we're going to look at, which is militant democracy, the idea that you can use even illiberal means against global authoritarians, both internally and externally, to try to ensure that democracy is upheld globally. Okay, then in week 10, we're just going to conclude. I'm going to wrap up and I'll go through the assignments. Okay, a couple more housekeeping points before the break. There's no recommended purchase for this course. 2 most useful books are a book I wrote 2018 and also a book by Cecile Fabre, whose work informs quite a lot of the module. Some other generally useful books. All of these are available online. And each week you're going to be required to do a seminar task. I'll say more about that in the seminars themselves, but for now let's have a quick break. So 5 minutes, so we'll start again at 11:45.
Doesn't show my seats.
Okay.
Yeah, so if I want to register for the attendance, just maybe I should like write something to.
Yeah, if you could just email me.
Email you.
Yeah, and I'll sort it out.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I
Another
can-
question is like I think that like our final answer would be online, right? I just do
The
something
exam,
else.
yeah,
Yes,
the
yes.
exam, yeah, will be online. Yeah, yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yeah. Does anyone see the bin? Okay, I'll make it 11:45, so let's get started again. So in this part of the lecture, I want to run through the responsibility to protect doctrine in a bit more detail. This is abbreviated to R2P, not R2D2. It's sometimes referred to as R2P like this. So it's either R2P or sometimes it's R2P. Now, the R2P, responsibility to protect, is the notion that there's a responsibility, an obligation, or a duty to do something in response to mass atrocities. there's a requirement that you have to do something in response to them. You can't stand by. Now, why is it important for this module? Why are we going to spend the second half of the lecture looking at it? It's because it's the predominant way that you'll find that responses to mass atrocities are framed in the literature and in discussions. And it's also the predominant way that looking at a lot of the alternatives are framed. So when you do your readings, you'll often find that they'll mention the RTP, the responsibility to protect doctrine. So I wanted to give you an introduction to it so you can understand what it is they're talking about. Now, the general notion is quite straightforward, a responsibility to address mass atrocities. But there have been three main iterations of it, and I want to run through these because people often get confused about what exactly the R2P is, including sometimes in the literature. Now, what I want you to think about is the history I'm about to run through isn't that important. The most important thing, the thing you want to highlight, is what I'm going to get to in a few minutes, is the three-pillar approach. That's the thing to remember, the three-pillar approach. That's what's meant by R2P these days. Okay. So there's three iterations of it. It started with a report in 2001 on humanitarian intervention by the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. The ISIS, sometimes called ICIS, different to the ISIS involved in murdering lots of people. So this is the responsibility to protect. That's the name of the report. Commissioned by the Canadian government in response to a request by the then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. Now, the motivation for this report stemmed out of two key events. The first of which was Rwanda in what one of you mentioned earlier, Rwanda in 1994. $800,000 people slaughtered in a matter of months. There was a peacekeeping force. It left under pressure from Western powers not wanting their own peacekeepers to die. They were underfunded, under-resourced. Millions, hundreds of thousands died unnecessarily. It's viewed as a big stain on the conscience of the international community. So Rwanda, the level of killing was phenomenal, the rate of killing. And the other one was Kosovo. 1999, there was intervention. The UN Security Council, however, did not authorize that intervention. It was undertaken by NATO, US bombing, undertaken in order to protect the Kosovan Albanians from Milosevic's Serbia. Now that was very controversial because it was done essentially illegally against international law. There are some legal debates, but generally it's viewed as illegal. So the international community had this issue. How are we going to ensure that something is done without in the future breaking international law? And the responsibility to protect was the idea to try to stem these issues, to try to address these issues. The report argues that we should replace the notion of sovereignty as authority with the notion of sovereignty as responsibility. Now, the notion of sovereignty as authority is the idea that what happens within a state is its own business and it can do what it likes to its own population. It has unlimited power to do what it wants. Sovereignty is authority. The notion of sovereignty as responsibility is the idea that the state has a responsibility to uphold its citizens' basic human rights. We should understand sovereignty as about this responsibility. It's about looking after your citizens. Now, sovereignty as responsibility, the report argues, lies with the state. It's the state's first responsibility. But this is a crucial move. When that state is failing to do so, the sovereignty transfers to the international community, which has responsibility to react to the crisis. So it's the UK's responsibilities to look after the British citizens, Burundi's responsibility to look after its citizens, and so on. But if a state is unable or unwilling to do so, the responsibility to protect these citizens transfers to the international community, which has this responsibility to react. Now, what this reaction might mean is controversial, and this is what we're going to look at in the module. But according to this report, it can on occasion include humanitarian intervention. So most notably, in 2011, the United Kingdom, the United States and France and other NATO members undertook an intervention in Libya with the authorization of the UN Security Council, and it invoked the responsibility to protect. So the argument was that Gaddafi regime was not fulfilling its sovereignty as responsibility, and so that transferred to the international community. So what's key are two key claims. This claims sovereignty as responsibility, and secondly, the international community has a duty, a responsibility, an obligation, if you like, to do something about it. It's not something that it can choose not to do, it has to be reacting. Okay, so that's the core of this idea from the original report, 2001 report. Now, it caught on a bit, this language of responsibility to protect in the international community. States started using it, NGOs started using it, and at the 2005 UN World Summit, they agreed to it. And this is the second major iteration. So if you look at this, 150 heads of state here, one of the largest gathering ever as heads of state, and they agreed to, in the final outcome document from this big discussion they had, there's a couple of paragraphs where they agreed to the responsibility to protect. At the time, this summit, not much was achieved because there was the Bush administration in charge in the United States. And they opposed a lot of things, including some of the wording of the responsibility to protect in these documents. But they did manage to get some agreement on this. Now, the agreement is something of a watershed moment for humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect, because it says, in principle at least, that humanitarian intervention can be permissible in very limited circumstances of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. It has to be through the UN Security Council. And it's only these 4 cases, and it has to be through the UN Security Council. The document also emphasises very much that you should be preventing things, preventing atrocities, and also emphasises that there's a lot more that can be done in addition to military intervention, along with the themes of this module. Okay, so this was a big step. 2005 World Summit. We had this kind of more academic-y sort of report, but then states actually agreed to something. They moderated it a bit, focused it a bit. The UN Security Council focused and the particular focus on those 4 crimes weren't in the original report. They narrowed it down to get this agreement amongst all states. And then that led to the 3rd iteration, which was a report by Ban Ki-moon, former UN Secretary General, 2009. And to reiterate, this is the predominant way to now understand the RTP. If you're going to write around the RTP, if you're going to do anything on it, this is the one to use. And particularly not the original ISIS version, this is the version to use. Now what this does is it transfers the very few couple of paragraphs that were in this document into something a lot more substantive. It's coherent with the 2005 UN World Summit, but it fleshes it out very, very carefully and diplomatically. And it frames the RTP in terms of 3 pillars. Pillar 1, protection responsibility of states. This is what they call, Ban Ki-moon calls the bedrock of the RTP. It's the core part of it. Very simple. States have obligations to look after their own citizens, and in particular, not to engage in mass atrocities of them. You shouldn't slaughter your own population. Now this doesn't do anything particularly interesting because there's already a lot of human rights law that makes exactly those claims as well, but it just frames it nicely. So pillar 1, the state has got its own responsibilities to its citizens. That's effectively the same as the sovereignty is responsibility point that I mentioned earlier. Now on to pillar 2. Now pillar 2 is called international assistance and capacity building. This name is really unhelpful. What it means is helping states with their consent. It's when they're willing to do something about mass atrocities but unable to do so. So it might be that rebels are overrunning an area and the state doesn't have the capacity to deal with it. And it asks for assistance, or another state offers assistance. So this is consensual. Give you a recent example, well, relatively recent. In northern Iraq, the Yazidis were being under serious threat from ISIS, threat of being killed, and the United States, with the consent of the Iraqi government, intervened to protect the Yazidis. Another example, more controversial than that one, was that France intervened in Mali and Central African Republic with the consent of the states involved. That's with the consent. Now I've given some military intervention examples, but there's also more mundane things that Pillar 2 can involve. So it can involve helping states develop early warning capacity so that they know whether there's going to be mass atrocities. And it can also be about making various reforms, helping them to reform their judiciary, helping them to reform their police, to ensure that there's not going to be atrocities. Okay, and on to Pillar 3. This is the most controversial pillar by far. This is where the action is. It's about when the state is unwilling. It's unwilling to respond to mass atrocities within its borders. So it differs from Pillar 2. Pillar 2, remember, is when it's unable but willing. Here it's unwilling. So it's about trying to get states such as Sudan, that's currently ongoing, or Syria in the 2011, from stopping killing and persecuting their people. Now, the most obvious and most controversial thing under this pillar is military intervention. But as this module is going to emphasize a lot, and we're going to look at throughout the next kind of 10 weeks, there's lots of other measures that we consider, and that would fall under Pillar 3. And the most obvious one is that we're going to look at in 2 weeks' time, which is economic sanctions. Okay, I want to check that you've all understood this, the RTP. Have you got anyone got any questions or things they're a little bit unsure about? Don't worry if you have. Lots of academics get it wrong. So if you got any questions, just put your hand up. No, well, there'll be a chance to ask questions as well in the seminars too. Okay. This document on this also emphasizes it as well. Nicely explains it. So you've got Pillar 1, primary responsibility of the state. You've got Pillar 2, international community's responsibility, but this is all the consensual stuff. Pillar 3, timely and decisive action. This is the non-consensual stuff. Reminder, it's focused on 4 particular crimes as well. Okay. So why does the RTP matter? I've already said a bit about this, but let me say a bit more. So the reason why it matters is because of this international agreement in 2005 UN World Summit. It's something that states have been using, international community has been using, this idea that there is a lot of support, at least for the central premises. And secondly, as I've already alluded to, it's the main language that has been used, at least until very recently, rather than the language of humanitarian intervention. There was even... This is not going to work. I'm doing the same thing again. So even an RTP rap.
Or the responsibility to protect
I have to warn you, this is
which is
terrible.
to be performed by Murat and Joe's band. Enjoy.
This is by Slovenia's biggest rap stars.
This is the song called R2P. Maestro musica. Responsibility to protect. Reading the news, watching TV, violence, crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, genocide, people killing people and they used to live side by side. I can't understand it. We all live on the same planet. We're all in this together and it's gonna get worse for everyone if we don't make it better. With all this drama in the world you see, we gotta talk about the R2P. Remind our governments about 2005. Demand to take action when bad times arise. I'm just a rapper from Slovenia, my English ain't perfect, but if the message gets across, it'll make it all worth it. Don't let the pain increase. R2B on the way to world peace. We got the responsibility to protect. Tell your government, tell your president. We got the responsibility to protect. Tell your parliament, they must understand. We got the responsibility to protect. Tell your government, tell your president. We got the responsibility to protect. R2P, R2P. Hey, Mr. President, remember the document from September 2005. It's when the UN agreed that the concept of R2P must come alive. Remember Rwanda? I wonder, are we going to make another such blunder? It's up to you, bear that in mind. Do not betray the trust of mankind. People of every religion, nation and race, we must prevent atrocities in the first place. But when they are committed, it's time to react. We need to protect our brothers and sisters from being tortured and killed, or else accept responsibility for the blood spilled. Yes, we can rebuild, destroy souls, let the people go on. We can't leave them all on their own. One humanity, one love, one earth, one sky above. This is not about them, you see. This is about you and me. We have the responsibility to protect. Tell your government, tell your president. We got the responsibility to protect. Tell your parliament, they must understand. We got the responsibility to protect. Tell your government, tell your president. We got the responsibility to protect. R2P, R2P. It is our responsibility. Stop the crimes against humanity. Stop ethnic cleansing. Stop war crimes. Stop genocide. We're the ones who decide. It is our responsibility. Stop the crimes against humanity. Stop ethnic cleansing. Stop war crimes. Stop genocide. We're the ones who decide. We got the responsibility to protect. Tell your government. Tell your president. We got the responsibility.
I was at the conference where you want to give it. I was at a conference where they presented this. Well, they presented it quite a few times, but sung this. And there was one of the former president of Slovenia and one of the candidates to become one of the next UN Secretary General, and he had to stand there and watch this performance live, and his face was quite interesting. Anyway, there is also an R2P choir that's even worse, and I won't. I don't have a video. I do have a video of that, but I'm not going to torment you with that. Okay. So there was a lot of movement around R2P, a lot of support, a lot of discussion of it. Became one of the main topics in international politics. Also subject to some major objections and queries, though. And I want to run through these now. So one concern with R2P is about military intervention, about humanitarian intervention. For some reason, it doesn't want to do the video when it's in full player. Okay. So the fact that NATO's intervention in Libya in 2011, in particular, led to regime change. It went beyond simply protecting those in Libya, but to remove Gaddafi, was extremely controversial. Several states were critical of the intervention, of the action, and in turn, the idea of the responsibility to protect. The worries about intervention and war, which we're going to look at next week in more detail, remain still lingering despite the agreement at the 2005 World Summit. Now, advocates respond to some of these. Advocates of the R2P defenders say that there's a lot more to the R2P than military intervention, and you shouldn't associate the two. There are links. You shouldn't necessarily associate the two so much. And secondly, some would just bite the bullet and say sometimes humanitarian intervention is justified, even if it might be problematic sometimes it's justified. So there's two replies that advocates maintain. Another major controversy and criticism is that it's just another form of Western imperialism. Used by the West, RTP used by the West to justify new forms of imperialism, interfering unjustifiably, and used to legitimize them doing so. Long history of states using humanitarian reasons to justify their actions. Hitler used humanitarian rhetoric to justify his invasion, the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia. Russia invoked humanitarian justifications for its intervention in Georgia in the 2000s. Long history of the abuse of humanitarian justification. Used to legitimize Western imperialism, this argument holds. Now, there are a series of replies to this objection in the literature. And you can think about these yourself and see whether you think they're persuasive or not. I'm just going to lay them out here. So one reply is that what matters is addressing mass atrocities whenever they occur. And the argument goes that powerful states might have undertaken humanitarian intervention in the past, but they were justified to do so. So it just bites the bullet and says what matters is saving people's lives, even if occasionally the notion might be abused. The argument says that states were right to intervene in places such as Libya and Kosovo that I've mentioned today, or Bosnia is another example. And that they were wrong when they didn't do sufficient action, such as in Rwanda in 1994. So the first reply just says it's justified anyway. It's the right thing to do, even if there is an allegation of Western imperialism. So that's one reply. But I think a more interesting one, and the one that I want to highlight for this module, challenges the premises of the objection. And this is that brings us to the second one. And actually all of the rest of the other four. So object replies 2 to 5. And it says that, first of all, the objection overlooks the non-Western bases of the responsibility to protect. And it frames it as a Western doctrine, but in fact, the doctrine, framing it like that, itself adopts a colonial mentality, an imperialist mentality. It ignores the contributions made by states and actors in the global south towards developing the responsibility to protect. So one of the key ideas is sovereignty as responsibility. And this comes from Francis Deng, who is from South Sudan, a scholar, came up with the idea of sovereignty as responsibility, become a major UN figure, and served as the UN Under-Secretary General for the Prevention of Genocide. So the point is that the intellectual history of R2P isn't, the reply goes, is not necessarily Western. And it's a very interesting piece I put on the recommended reading for this week that's very recently out, that argues that the critique of the R2P should itself be decolonized. The critique of the R2P should be itself decolonized. Thirdly, picking up on that theme, the reply goes, many of the actions undertaken to address mass atrocities, although we often focus on Libya or Kosovo, the Global South actors have undertaken many of the main initiatives to address mass atrocities. These are far less appreciated, far less discussed. So there were humanitarian interventions by India in East Pakistan in 1971. India, in East Pakistan in 1971. Vietnam, the Vietnamese intervened in Cambodia to stop the Khmer Rouge. A really brutal genocide by the Khmer Rouge. One of the worst of all time. Tanzania intervened in the early 80s against Idi Amin's Uganda. Again, a really brutal regime that was slaughtering his population. More recently, ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, has led military actions in Sierra Leone and Liberia in the 1990s, and as this picture captures, the Gambia in 2017, so more recently, the Gambia in 2017. There are also lots of peacekeeping operations by the African Union with a robust mandate. And of course, there are lots of non-military options and engagements by states in the Global South. So this response emphasizes that there's a lot being done by Global South states that that is important to highlight, and that the critique misses their agency, is what the argument goes, misses their agency. Fourthly, more straightforward still, some of the main supporters of R2P are states in the Global South. There's something called a group of friends of R2P, a group of friends, about 50 or 60 states, and these include states such as Ghana, Botswana, Peru, Costa Rica, lots of others, as well as Western states such as Canada, New Zealand, Netherlands. There's also states in the Global South that oppose R2P, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea. Also states in the West that oppose it. So I've already mentioned the Bush administration was pretty anti-R2P in the 2005 UN World Summit. It did not want to sign up in particular to the idea that there's an obligation to do something. It really wanted to resist this. The Trump administration, generally opposed to notions of the R2P. Obama had done quite a lot to try and get the United States to consider atrocity situations more seriously. Developed what's called the Atrocities Prevention Board that tried to put atrocities onto the foreign policy agenda within the United States. Trump administration, as you can expect, eroded that. So this fourth point is that we shouldn't necessarily view the Global South and the West as big, kind of these single things that we just take as a lump, and look in particular at each particular state, and each particular state have got different views. So we should go beyond the dichotomy of the Global South versus the West. And fifthly, this is the final point, is that the Global South states have been influencing how the responsibility to protect should be understood. Now, I'm not going to go through it, but there was a proposal, because it will just complicate things for you, but there was a Brazilian proposal called Responsibility While Protecting that tried to address some of the issues around military intervention under the R2P. And it generally was quite favourably responded to. But the point is that Global South actors have been contributing towards the development of R2P as well. Another way of putting it is that they are also the authors of R2P, the authors of R2P. Now, I'll leave it up, as I said, I'll leave it up to you to see whether you think that query is persuasive. Let's now move to another one, which is whether R2P really makes a difference. Now the skeptics, such as Aidan here, argue that R2P, its key novel elements, have had very little international support, in fact. He argues that it's all hot air, it's all empty rhetoric, and it doesn't make any difference to how states behave. It's not really done anything. And in particular, he argues that Pillar 1, which is, remember, the protection responsibilities of states, it doesn't add anything because there was already that legally with human rights law. And he argues Pillar 2 and 3 aren't sufficiently binding on states and don't actually change their behaviour. Don't change their behaviour. Now, when you read the literature on R2P, there's a lot of attention paid to debate about whether it makes a difference or not. It can get a bit dull, and it's quite technical. It relates to questions around norms, how we should understand norms. For your purposes, you don't really need to worry about that. I just wanted to flag up that this is one of the main issues. A lot of attention to this debate. But to some degree, this debate is also now being transcended by the fact that although this language is still around, it's still being used, there's another framing that's also taking its place, and that's the language of atrocity prevention. Now, atrocity prevention has become more popular because of the toxicity of the responsibility to protect, still from this intervention in Libya in 2011 in particular. So states have been using the language of atrocity prevention more in recent times, particularly over the last 3 or 4 years, atrocity prevention. But the ideas are still essentially the same. States are required to prevent atrocities beyond their borders. So there's still a responsibility element of it, but just flag up atrocity prevention, you'll sometimes come across that that's another framing now. Okay, before I go on to the alternative bases, do you have any questions or comments about the R2P? Okay, we've got about probably 3 to 5 minutes, depending on how I get through the last slide. So this is going to be the last slide. Okay. So we focused on the responsibility to protect. We've looked at how we should understand this. We should look at its core elements, some of the objections to it, some of the replies to the objections. Now, remember, we've looked at the R2P because this provides a normative basis, an ethical basis for why there's this imperative to do something, to respond to crises, why we should consider these ethics with the alternatives. Now, the R2P, as I mentioned, matters because generates this, matters because of what happened in Rwanda and Kosovo, has this intuitive pull that you should be doing something in response to the aftermath of Rwanda. So it gains this force from thinking about Rwanda, and it also gains force from the 150 or so heads of state that all signed up to this agreement. So this universal agreement. However, it's still quite thin philosophically on why exactly there is a responsibility to respond. So I want to finish the lecture by flagging up a bit more systematically why exactly there is, you might think that there's an obligation to tackle situations, crises in other states. And this is drawn from some of the more philosophical and ethical literature. And I'm going to run through these relatively quickly. We can discuss them a lot more in later weeks, but I just want to flag up these three key reasons why you might think that there's an obligation to tackle crises in other states, a responsibility to do something about it. The first are humanitarian duties. Very simple. There are duties to assist others in other states because they are fellow humans. Sometimes these are called duties of benevolence. Sometimes called duties of benevolence. Sometimes they're called Samaritan duties. So the idea is it doesn't matter where people live, what nationality they are, so on and so forth. Part of common humanity, you've got a humanitarian duty to assist them. So if they're suffering from mass atrocities, for instance, there's a humanitarian duty to do something about it. Now, these duties, humanitarian duties, in the philosophical, political philosophy literature, very uncontroversial. No one really disputes that there are some humanitarian duties. But it's controversial how weighty these are, so how much can be asked of states. So how much the UK, for instance, is required to do on the basis of humanitarian duties. The second one are duties of justice, international duties of justice, or global duties of justice. And the thought here is that we're all part of a shared global system, global socio-economic system. That means that it's not simply a matter of humanitarianism, there's also questions of justice involved. And this means that we should be assisting those beyond our borders. So there's a case for using sanctions or diplomacy or non-violence because we're all part of this shared system that's a matter of justice. Now there's big debates within the cosmopolitan literature, philosophical literature, on exactly how to understand this and whether there are principles of justice. You don't need to worry so much about those for this module. I'm just flagging up that there are what some people think duties of justice in addition to the humanitarian ones. Thirdly, there are reparative duties. The argument here is that a lot of the world's crises are in fact the fault of major injustices: colonialism, slavery, wars of aggression, and increasingly climate change. Unfair global economic system keeps the poor poor, enables the mass violation of basic human rights, leads to aggression and conflict. The argument is that those that are morally responsible for these harms have got duties to redress the situations that they've caused, sometimes indirectly, but that they've caused. So former colonial powers have got responsibilities stemming from their the major injustices to deal with the mess that they've caused, the contemporary mess that they've caused. They're required to repair them. They're reparative. They're required to repair them. So it's a duty of reparation. It's sorting out the mess that you've created. As we saw in the video I showed earlier, some of the states that have endured mass atrocities and major conflicts have been former states that have been former colonies. The argument is that there are duties of reparation owed to those, potentially by the former colonial powers, to help resolve those situations. But reparations might involve more than colonialism and slavery. As I mentioned, climate change might be another thing you can think about. So states that have been polluting might be required to address the crises that climate change is causing at the moment, and let alone in the future. Okay, so those are three more philosophical bases of this imperative to respond. Remember, we're not going to focus in detail on these. I just want to flag up this provides some of the theoretical basis for why there's an imperative to respond. This module is focused on the means of responding, the ways to respond. It's still worth bearing in mind that underlying this, there might be these three different bases that can sometimes pull in different directions. And we're going to pull out, at various times during the module, we'll pull on those threads and see where we end up. Okay. Okay, well, that's it. Seminars start this week. We looked at R2P this week. Next week, we're going to focus on just war theory and in particular critique of war implied by just war. So see you all on Friday.